Hello Anglophonians, and welcome to another episode where we take a look at the European comic culture. And this time it's Spain's turn again. We take a look at another adventure of Mort and Phil, and this one is called Mort and Phil versus the Pork Rind Gang. The year is 1969. After the first long story with an adventure of Mort and Phil, Bruguera publishes the next episode as a comic book, Mort and Phil versus the Pork Rind Gang. A small content warning at this point: Mort and Phil, or rather their creator Ibanez, are not immune to racist stereotypes either. A few of them appear in this book. The first thing the reader notices is that the structure of the story is slightly different than in the first one. Although the first story was structured in episodes, there was no visible separation and the story itself developed continuously. In this book, there is a strict separation of episodes through individual chapter headings. Mort and Phil are called to headquarters at the beginning of the story. They finally arrive there in a completely overcrowded tram, and their boss explains to them that the international spy gang of a certain Gidéon, called El Chicharrón, Pork Rind, wants to come into the country. This gang consists of the leader Gidéon El Chicharrón, as well as Mike Ratatatata, the machine gunner responsible for spying on trains, Anselmo the pachyderm, responsible for espionage in the harbor, Wo Tiho, from China, who spies at the airport and, of course, is a martial arts expert. Joe Potopotopop, the motorcyclist, who has mastered motorcycling and spying on the streets, Mac Ochuelo, who sabotages the river's underwater defenses, Snow White. Snow White. Spying in the mines. He's spying in... We talk about it in a moment. Viscount Godfrey, who spies on kings and palaces. Well, I might remind you that Spain is a monarchy after all. Orzuela the Arab, who steals plans from safes, and Caracol the Mongol, specialized in fast running. Each chapter is about Mort and Phil taking down a member of Gidéon's gang. However, it is always the case that the two of them catch the spy in question with the help of chance. In the final chapter, the whole gang breaks out of prison and Mort and Phil have to catch them again. Interestingly, this comic ends on a positive note. In later books, the story will end with Mort and Phil doing something at the end which usually upsets their boss and they have to run away from him. Furthermore, in this comic we see a direct caricature. Caracol was designed in the likeness of Julio Fernandez, a member of the Bruguera publishing house. Fernandez was an editorial director and comic book writer. Before I start the next section, an urgent note. I'm an absolute fan of Francisco Ibanez and his works. Nevertheless, when looking at things like this, you also have to emphasize on the critical notes. Otherwise, there will be no further development. In this regard, Ibanez has developed over the years. And the comic we are looking at today is, so to speak, a historical document of its time. And to those who complain that you can't say anything anymore, I would like to say, what's so great about hurting others? With that in mind, let's talk about racist stereotypes. European comics in the 20th century often reflected the prevailing societal attitudes towards race, resulting in the propagation of racist stereotypes within their narratives and characterizations. These stereotypes were deeply entrenched in the cultural fabric of the time, perpetuating harmful misconceptions and prejudices. One of the most prevalent racist stereotypes in European comics was the portrayal of non-white characters as primitive, exotic, or inherently inferior to their white counterparts. This was often evident in the depiction of characters from Africa, Asia, and other non-European regions, who were frequently depicted as savage, uncivilized, and in need of white intervention or domination. These portrayals not only reinforced colonialist ideologies, but also contributed to the dehumanization of entire groups of people based on race. Furthermore, European comics often depicted racial minorities through caricatured and exaggerated physical features, reinforcing harmful stereotypes and reducing complex identities to one-dimensional caricatures. For example, African characters were frequently depicted with exaggerated facial features, dark skin, and portrayed as unintelligent or comically inept. Similarly, Asian characters were often portrayed with stereotypical features such as slanted eyes, buck teeth, and speaking broken or pidgin English, perpetuating harmful stereotypes of Asian people as inscrutable or deceitful. These racist stereotypes in European comics were reflective of the broader societal attitudes towards race during the 20th century and yes, even the later 20th century. This was a time marked by colonial expansion, imperialism, and racial hierarchies, where notions of white superiority and racial essentialism were widespread. European societies justified their colonial exploits through narratives of racial superiority and the civilizing mission, which were often reinforced and normalized through popular culture, including comics. Moreover, the political climate of the 20th century, marked by 2 world wars and the rise of fascist ideologies, further exacerbated racial tensions and xenophobic sentiments. European comics, as a form of mass media, both reflected and perpetuated these attitudes, serving as a means of reinforcing dominant power structures and ideologies. However, it is essential to acknowledge that not all European comics of the 20th century perpetuated racist stereotypes. There were artists and creators who challenged these prevailing narratives and sought to subvert stereotypes through their work. Nevertheless, the pervasive presence of racist stereotypes in European comics during this time underscores the need for critical reflection and examination of how popular culture both reflects and shapes societal attitudes towards race and ethnicity. By recognizing and confronting these harmful representations, we can work towards creating a more inclusive and equitable society. In 1969, many of the former European colonies were already independent from their former master countries. Nevertheless, there was a generation living at the time that had received a similar upbringing from their parents and for whom it was normal to use ethnic stereotypes to make fun of minorities. That's why we continue to see these stereotypes long after direct colonialism ended. However, colonialism in people's minds still existed. That's why it's not about banning these old comics. It's about becoming aware of how media and society influence each other and which society we want to live in the future. It's about looking at these old comics through a lens and leaving the stereotypes behind. But we can only do this if we consciously deal with it. Even people who have a very liberal attitude have to actively deal with the upbringing they received. In a comic that we will look at later in this series, the illustrator André Franquin drew a scene in a shop. Unconsciously, he drew the dealer of the shop as a stereotypical Jew, a decision which he himself later described as stupid. Only when one realizes how deeply these attitudes have sunk in and how they are passed on to the following generations even after the end of colonialism, can we overcome the stereotypes? And that doesn't mean that someone from a certain ethnic group is immune to criticism or satire, but this should not be based on ethnic stereotypes, but on the attitude of the individual person. Because that is what a person can change, but you can't change the way you look. So there you have it, Mort and Phil versus the Pork Rind Gang. Yeah. Next time we take another look at the Europa Park, but until then, like and subscribe, don't forget it. You know, because of the 8 million billion bazillion subscriber mark. Really important, Or is this the place where I should mention Patreon? Yeah, Patreon. Do Patreon or something like that. Well, next time, as I said, Europa Park. Until then, take good care of yourself and see you.